Hi, welcome to The Witch in the Woods, and this is, of course, a spring equinox and Ostara video. Again, I've already made 3. I've got to admit the last 2 I've made weren't particularly good, so this is the 3rd one. And so let's talk a little bit more in depth about Ostara this time. So, Ostara, or the spring equinox, is of course a time of rebirth and renewal. And the sun returns and it marks the beginning of either springtime, or here in Britain it's pretty much the start of summertime. I think springtime kind of starts at around February. It is of course a point of balance, a point of equal day and equal night, and from here on in we shift over into the light half of the year. And this of course is the time of growth and fruitfulness and prosperity. Because this was often a time of coming out of times of deep cold and hunger and scarcity, it was marked by our northern ancestors as a time of rebirth. This mythic figure of Jesus, who was reborn after 3 days of death, was of course a Christian regeneration story. But this resurrection of the vegetation god can be seen in many cultures. He can also be seen in Osiris, in the Green Man, and of course here we have the figure of the trickster, who is the April Fool, and he is also a vegetation god. He is the beginning of youthfulness and vitality, and the joy returning, of course, because we've come out of the bleak and cold times and we can actually go outdoors and enjoy the sunshine. There's a whole sense of joy about this season. So spring equinox, many people see it as a time of celebrating a goddess who the Wiccans call Ostara, but it is also celebrated through the Green Man, through Osiris, and through the April Fool. It's also a time of leaping hares and chattering birds, The birds are very loud right now. They're singing and mating and calling. And of course they're building their nests and laying their eggs. So it's a time of happiness and joy and vivacity, outgoingness. And this is often symbolised by the springing up of the golden daffodils, this beautiful, joyous, sunlight-coloured flower. So Easter is the name of the Christian celebration, and I would like to say that I don't see any evidence, I don't want to upset anyone now, that the spring equinox itself was ever celebrated by our ancestors. In fact, what was celebrated in many cultures, and probably by our ancestors, especially our Anglo-Saxon here in the east side of Britain, the Anglo-Saxon and the Norse ancestors would mainly celebrate the full moon following spring equinox. Now, this year Easter is on the 17th, and this is the first Sunday after the full moon following the spring equinox. It is a time when we are past that point of balance, that point of uncertainty, and the sunlight is definitely gaining strength. So it's celebrated on the full moon after the equinox. Now it happens to be a full moon tonight as well. The next full moon is April the 17th. So a little bit of a word about our ancient calendar. What we know of our calendars, we only really got recorded in the early sort of 8th, 9th century. And before that we don't really know much. But Bede did record that the full moon in March was a celebration of this goddess called Rita, and was called Reedmanath. So that would be this full moon that I am filming this on now, which is the full moon in March. The next full moon, the full moon after the spring equinox, was a feast that was held for Ostara, and this was a celebration of the rising tide of the year. And so there are two celebrations either side of the equinox. One, they're both dedicated to goddesses. So one was a sacrifice to this goddess Rita, and the next one was a feast in celebration of the goddess Ostara. So the goddess Ostara is associated now with with Easter, with hares and with eggs, and these are obviously symbols of fertility. She is also associated with the rising sun and with the dawn. So she is a sun goddess associated with the returning light, the strength of the sun as it comes into fullness. So many traditions surround the Easter egg at this time of year, the symbol of the egg. And, excuse my fire, it's a very noisy fire. And so the egg also symbolises the sun. If you think of breaking open an egg, you are breaking open the yellow yolk inside, which is a symbol of the sun and a symbol of the life force, really. And it represents the birth of new life. So in many ways, when we break open an Easter egg, we are cracking open the shell to bring that new life into fruition. But many traditions wouldn't actually break open an Easter egg, but would keep the egg as a symbol of luck and protection. And this is very common in Slavic countries, in countries like Ukraine. And in Ukraine these eggs were called Pysanky. Well, that's the plural of Pysanka, which is a singular. And we can trace the making of these Pysanky eggs back before Christianity. And so I think they found the earliest shells that were painted. Obviously eggs are very fragile, so they haven't found any whole eggs. So they found Pysanky that were painted from the 900s, from the 10th century, that is. And I think in Ukraine, if I'm right, Christianity didn't reach there till about the 12th century. So these are definitely pre-Christian symbolic fertility symbols, pagan fertility symbols. And the tradition is that the Slavs worshipped a sun god called Dazbog, and Dazbog was the almighty god. The return of Dazbog symbolised the returning life force. And he was celebrated at spring festivals. But the legend goes that Dazbog, the almighty god, was beyond the reach of us poor mortals. However, birds were sacred to him, because birds were the only animals who could fly high enough to get close to him. And these sacred animals, although we couldn't catch these sacred animals, what we could do is get their eggs. And so eggs became magical objects that symbolised life source and fertility, but also the sacred animals of the sun god. So the eggs were magical talismans, and they were decorated with beautiful decorations in dyes and beeswax. And the making of these eggs was very symbolic, and they were made during sort of the uprun to the full moon in April. And they would make as many eggs as they possibly could. The more eggs they could decorate, the better it was, and they would keep these eggs for years. And they wouldn't hollow out the eggs. They were full eggs, they were whole eggs, and they just kept them until they dried out in the centre. And often they would varnish them and keep them for years and years and gift them to everybody. So there was a certain number they would gift, and as you made the eggs, you were to think of the person that you were making the egg for. And it was said that you had only to think of positive thoughts. You had to not let any negative thoughts enter your mind while you were making the egg. Otherwise, you would taint the object, this magical object. And the making of Pysanky eggs was said to keep at bay the dreadful forces of evil, and in particular to keep away the serpent, who was the symbol of evil, and to stop him from wreaking havoc on the earth. And this was renewed every year at this time of year. And so many eggs would be made, and many eggs would be gifted to all of the community. So the symbols on the Pysanka were very important. They were covered in Gesundheit. They were covered in spirals, flowered seeds, wavy lines, mandala-like symbols, crosses, and these were protective and fertility symbols. So spirals were said to trap evil in their spiral shape. They were also said to trap the evil of the serpent. They also painted serpents on the eggs. They'd also paint flowers, crosses. They would paint seeds as symbols of fertility, which were dots, wavy lines, which were symbolic of ploughed fields, and forks and hoes and symbols of agriculture and farming. The colours were very important with which they would dye these Pysanky too, and yellow was to represent the sun. It would also represent the fields, the bounteous fields of corn. Colours like red was the most important colour, and this was the oldest colour too, and it represented the lifeblood, the life force itself. Red was very often gifted to younger people, but they would give eggs that were painted predominantly black to older people, and this was to represent the wisdom and knowledge that these people had gained and the life that had been. It's having a fierce go, that log. Okay. So this egg was varnished and kept for years as a symbol of magical protection. Now, I tried to make some Pysanky, and it's quite an easy batik method of dyeing an egg. You put wax lines on the egg, and wherever the wax is, obviously you get a batik print so that no dye can penetrate. Then you would soak them in a food colouring with just a tablespoon of vinegar in there, and that just helps the dye to sort of take. And then you would take them out when they were suitably dyed, and you would add more wax, and then dye them in a different colour, and then add more wax and dye them in a different colour. And this way you would get many layers of different dyes and different patterns. I've got to admit, there is a technique where you can use a pin on a stick, which I tried, and I found it very hard. In fact, I made quite a mess of it. I found it quite lumpy. So I tried to dye it in the first colour, which was a very weak yellow, and on a brown egg it didn't really work. So I kind of abandoned it at that point because it was sort of 10 o'clock at night and I was getting tired. So instead I just made brightly coloured eggs with the vegetable dye, the food colouring dye. You can also use vegetable dyes, and boiled the eggs for brightly coloured eggs, which is pretty much the same symbolism. But if you want to try that technique, then I think it makes some beautiful eggs like that. Personally, I decided that I might try it next year, but I'm going to get one of those, get a little stylus that's got an inkwell in that you can fill up with wax, and they produce a lovely smooth line. I think they're called a katka, and you can buy them, they're quite cheap. And I think, to be honest, I'm going to try this again, but I'm going to do it properly. So I'm sorry about the failed little bit of an experiment there, but I did dye some pretty coloured eggs. So this brings us on to the idea of Easter as we know it, as a Christian celebration. And I've heard it said online quite a lot that many people consider Ostara, the neo-pagan celebration of Ostara, as a paganised Christian festival, and quite a lot of people find it a little off-putting that it's not a real festival, it's a paganised Christian festival. And this is something to do with Doreen Valiente, I think, who kind of wanted a mainstream, middle of the road festival, Christian festival, that she could call a a pagan festival but still be acceptable to sort of the family around her and society, and she invented Ostara. Now, I would like to argue that the celebration of Easter actually goes further back in time to pre-Christian traditions, and you can tell this because it is celebrated on the full moon following the spring equinox. It is always celebrated on the fourth full moon of the year after the winter solstice. So, like we see in our Christian Christmas festival, we have a lot of symbolism, such as the tree and the baubles and the decorations, the evergreens, that have very little to do with a Christian festival. The same could be said of Ostara. We have the symbol of eggs and bunnies that have sod all to do with Christianity or with Christ being raised again after being killed on the cross. And I would say that this is absolute proof that the festival is a pagan festival that was there long before it was taken over in Christian tradition. So I think that is fairly conclusive that there is nothing to do with eggs in a Christian tradition. So another festival that's celebrated around this time of year is the Sigurblot, and this is celebrated by heathens and is mentioned in the Ilinga saga by Snorri Sturluson. Ilinga saga. I used to be able to say that. It doesn't sound right to my head now. That is an Ilinga saga, isn't it? So anyway, this was also called the Victory Blot, and it would mark the time of year when people could go abroad again. The seas were calm, they could take to the seas, they could travel, they could trade, and they could raid and make war. And they held a sacrifice at this time of year for victory in the season ahead. So, a Sigurblot was an offering to the gods for victory, and it was held on the fourth full moon after the new moon following the winter solstice. So it was also held around about the fourth full moon in April. So that would tie to another pre-Christian festival that was held at this time of year to celebrate the outcoming season, the rising of the tide, the heat and the sun returning and summer returning. So this was mentioned in the 12th century by Snorri Sturluson, but Bede does not mention Sigurblot. He mentions, as I said, Reed Monoth and Ostara Monoth. Now, Ostara as a goddess, or Eostre as Bede called her, is a dubious goddess. There's not a lot of mention of Ostara. And it would seem that she was a local goddess. She may be based on a Roman pantheon, or a Celtic Roman pantheon, who we can tell by the inscriptions that have been found dedicated to the Matrone Hare. And this is a triple mother goddess called Hare or Ostara. And these are only found, it would seem, around about France, England, Frisia and maybe Saxony. There is some reference to her in Germanic culture, with the month of April being called Ostra Monoth. So she seems to be a local goddess. There are a few place names named to her. One is up the road, and one day I will go there, but I had a look and there's not a lot to be seen there, so I might not go there. But anyway, one of the place names is up the road. I'm going to put a name there because I can't remember it right now. So Eostre, of course, is named after this goddess Ostara, but only the English and the Germans, I think it's Germans, call it Easter. Everyone else calls it Pascha, which is of course the Jewish festival of Passover. So it would seem to be very much a Celtic festival. So the hare was never associated with Ostara originally, not that we know of. It was associated with a number of other goddesses. Doesn't mean that it wasn't associated with her, it's just that we do not have any evidence. But it was associated with the goddess Hare, and Hare was said to be followed by a cohort of hares who carried torches. And of course Hare is the goddess of winter, so following her departure arrived these hares carrying torches. The hare was also associated with many love goddesses, Aphrodite and Venus, and of course these are fertility goddesses and love goddesses, and the hare of course is a symbol of fertility. Apparently the hare can conceive two broods, two litters at the same time, which would explain why she was they were particularly symbolic of fertility, hares and rabbits. The hare of course is also associated with the full moon, giving us another clue that this is a full moon festival. So the neo-pagan festival of the spring equinox, I don't believe was actually celebrated on the spring equinox. I do believe it can be celebrated for a month either side of the full moons. Either side of the spring equinox are particularly potent and important and powerful. So if anything, I would say that you can celebrate for a whole month either way, either side of this point of balance. The point of balance is a marker point, but when we go into the full moon, as I say, this is the time when the sun is actually gaining strength. Like we don't celebrate Christmas on the 21st, we celebrate it after the winter solstice, because it's the time when the tide has turned and the power is rising. So that's all I have to say on Ostara. If you've got any comments on that, you can add them on in the box below. I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you for listening. I'm supposed to ask you to like and subscribe and all that stuff, I always forget. Thank you for being here. I wish you a very blessed Ostara and a very merry full moon. It's a full moon tonight and I'm feeling kind of a bit frisky. I am. It's beautiful out there because the skies are clear. Oh, it's lovely. We've got sunshine. Oh, I just feel so joyous. I'm going to go and skip around in the fields now. So I wish you all the best and I hope to speak to you soon. Cheers. Bye.